Good evening. I'm addressing this video to a man who, quite frankly, will probably be too busy to ever see it. The Honorable Volodymyr Zelensky, President of the Republic of Ukraine. First and foremost, Mr. President, I salute you. In a world full of pretenders in fancy suits, there aren't many heads of state who would have had the guts to tell the West, I need ammunition, not a ride, or to address their people from barely a kilometer outside the hot zone in Kupiansk. That kind of courage is, I'm sorry to say, far too lacking from leaders of the 21st century, as I'm sure you've discovered. And I know I speak for a great many Americans when I say, regardless of what Washington may say or do, we're with you and with your country. With that said, I'd like to talk for a moment about history. In the 1960s and 70s, the Republic of Vietnam, that's South Vietnam to most people, was involved in a war for its very existence. A Russian-backed separatist movement in its northern regions had led to the formation of a breakaway state called the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, what most people refer to as North Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government appealed to the United States for help, which we provided. For a while. Until the people at home started to complain about the cost. The United States was growing weary of the expense, but the people of South Vietnam, who knew they were fighting for the very survival of their country, refused to yield. President Nguyen Van Thieu of South Vietnam insisted that any treaty with the Russian-backed North would have to include security guarantees from the United States, promising that if the North and their Russian patrons resumed their aggression, the United States would return in force. Sound familiar? Well, on January 27th, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. Peace, or what called itself such, was achieved. The U.S. withdrew, promising to return if the North and their Russian backers ever renewed their aggression. I think we all know how that story ended up. In 1975, President Thieu, who had spent months calling on U.S. President Nixon to honor his security guarantee, calls which went unheeded because Nixon was too busy dealing with an impeachment scandal, resigned and went into exile. By the end of that year, the Russian-backed North rolled into Saigon, and where were the Americans? Where were their security guarantees? The Americans were frantically loading helicopters and abandoning our embassy as terrified South Vietnamese civilians pleaded for passage on the last choppers out. Mr. President, you recently met with my country's president, seeking an end to the war against the Russian and Russian-backed elements besieging Ukraine. One of the points you discussed was that any treaty with Russia must include security guarantees, promising that the U.S. will respond firmly and resolutely if Russia ever renews their aggression. Well, the ease with which Donald Trump swallowed the Kremlin's nonsensical tale of a phantom Ukrainian attack on Vladimir Putin's residence last weekend should offer a clue how serious the U.S. will be about honoring any such guarantee. And I'm sorry to say this is not new. The Republic of the Philippines holds a full-blown mutual defense treaty with the United States. In 2012, when China landed on the Philippine Republic's Panatag Shoal and began constructing military bases stocked with missiles pointed at Manila, what did the U.S. do? Nothing. Japan also holds such a treaty with the United States. When China began firing on any naval vessel that approached Japan's Senkaku Islands, which China illegally claimed, what did the U.S. do? Nothing. Taiwan has received security guarantees from the United States promising to respond in force if the mainland government ever attempts to seize the last bastion of the Republic Zhongshan built. At this very hour, Chinese warships are conducting live fire drills, firing live ammunition at Taiwanese civilian targets. The U.S. is nowhere to be found. And with all due respect, Mr. President, need I remind you of the Budapest Memorandum, wherein the U.S. already gave Ukraine such guarantees in return for the abandonment of Ukraine's former nuclear arsenal? Recall, Mr. President, how easy it was for all signatories to find excuses to forget those guarantees. It goes without saying that this is not an easy admission for me to make, but a security guarantee from my country is worthless. I implore you not to set your faith by them. The ease with which my country's president swallowed the Kremlin's story last week should already be proof of that. And as I said, I cannot say this is a trait unique to Donald Trump. It's been my country's standard procedure for nearly a century. The Tibetans, the Kurds, the Georgians. America walks away from their allies. It's kind of what we do. Now, as for Europe, well, they mean well, but cold reality is they're at least 5 years away from being ready to confront Russia. And China? Well, we both know they're actively aiding Russia. Ukraine is, for all intents and purposes, standing alone right now. If Ukraine can endure just a little bit longer, Russia's fading strength will fail and Ukraine will have peace. But the Kremlin knows that. And now, the Russian state, just like any other dying animal, is preparing to use every weapon they have left, no matter how devastating or fearsome. And Ukraine has learned the cold truth about how easy it is for allies to find excuses to look the other way. As valiant and frankly Herculean as Ukraine's fight has been, it's no secret that this is the Republic's most critical hour. So one might ask, what are you saying? That we should give up? That we should agree to the Kremlin's terms? Absolutely not. I think everyone knows exactly what the Kremlin's alleged desire for Ukraine to succeed would look like. So then, to whom should Ukraine turn? To whom can they turn? I think, Mr. President, you already know the answer, and you gave the world a reminder of it last month with the lighting of a menorah on the Maidan. Recall the origins of that symbol. The Maccabees. They led a band of Judean rebels who stood alone against a superpower who wanted to erase their very identity. The war had gone on for years by the time that lamp was finally lit in the temple. And who did they call upon for aid? Rome? Sparta? No. A power who was older than either of those, a lot more ready than Europe, and a lot more trustworthy than America. Their God. The same God whom Christians and Jews have in common. The God of Abraham. In the summer of 1940, when Britain was enduring heavy bombing by the Nazis, Prime Minister Winston Churchill called for a nationwide day of prayer to that same God. Twice, August 11th and September 8th. Each time, he called upon Britons from all walks of life to set aside a day from their busy lives to focus on appealing to their Creator, the one power no nation on earth could stand against. And it worked. Hitler was repelled. He couldn't prevail. Neither can Russia's dictator. Mr. President, if it seems prudent to you, might I suggest doing as Churchill and Maccabeus did? Let 2 consecutive days this month, let's say for instance the 10th and the 11th, be set aside as nationwide days of prayer. Prayer for peace, yes, but also for God to deliver peace in a way that keeps the aggressors from coming again. For divine deliverance from this enemy with their lack of regard for life. Let those days be set aside for prayer that God will say, as he said in the words of the prophet Ezekiel, I stand against you, Prince of Rosh. Let them be set aside for prayer that God, who has already protected Ukraine by strengthening her defenders, overwhelming Russia with natural calamities like the earthquake that destroyed her submarine base this summer, and throwing the Russian horde into disarray, will set his hand over Ukraine and finally, conclusively break the occupiers' ability to ever threaten Ukraine again. Because you see, Ukraine is not fighting alone. Ukraine has an ally who's never been beaten and never can. As I said, I don't know if this video will ever even reach its addressee. Certainly, it would be perfectly understandable if an open address posted on social media to a head of state in time of war didn't even get noticed, and that's fine. Meanwhile, to anyone in Ukraine or among her friends abroad who might see this video, I invite you to join me in doing as I've suggested in this video, and setting aside the 10th and the 11th of January, or whatever 2 days the President might find more appropriate if he sees this video and deems it prudent, as days of prayer. And in closing, I'd like to leave a short quote from an American poem called The Defense of Fort McHenry, whose first verse is more commonly known as the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. May they ring as true now as they did when they were written. And thus be it ever, when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved her a nation. Slava Ukraini! I Bog Avraam, najvyššia slava.